And just like that, it's Friday, and even though times are unusual, it'll be nice to step back from schoolwork and relax. Wouldn't you agree, sir? Yes, you, sir. Aren't you glad it's Friday? Given any thought to how you'll spend the weekend? Well, how about taking time to review what you've learned this week? Never forget that in this unconventional educational environment, it's important to have a plan. That's right. With our 3-part plan, you'll be sure to be ready for next week and for the weeks to come. First, review what you've learned. Take some time while things are slower to take another look at those areas that might have been unclear. Next, think ahead. Using what you've learned, consider where might lessons be going in the future? What should you be prepared for? And finally, do some research. It's never a bad time to learn more about your school-related personal interests. By connecting your interests with your schoolwork, you make both more meaningful. Remember, with a plan, indeed, we will succeed. Too much? In that case, keep it simple. Don't let the weekend give you time to forget what you've learned. Keep up with your studies, and you'll come out ahead.
Good morning, guys, or afternoon, or what have you. Happy Friday. As I said, please, as I also said, make sure that this weekend you have a plan in all your classes for how you're going to get where you need to get by Monday. Look at the scores so far from yesterday's work. Everything's looking pretty good, but there are a couple of things that I kind of want to go back and reinforce because I have a feeling for a couple of students, probably more than a couple, there are some questions that you still might have, especially when my math lab isn't there to help you. So really, what I'm going to talk about today is going to deal with the last 2 types of questions you had to do on last night's homework. And let me be clear. Today's work is going to be the first work that goes in for a grade. So just be aware of that and make sure you have an understanding before you begin. So first off, over here, hopefully by now, everybody's got a sense of what an exponential function is and how it looks and why it looks the way it does. So instead of b, which can sometimes be confusing, let's pretend that we were just doing a function. I hope you can see this okay. That's f of x equals 2 to the x power. So whatever value we choose for x, we're going to make that the exponent of the 2, and then we're going to compute that and see what we get on the other side. So the positive side is generally pretty easy to understand. So for example, if we pick an x value of 2, then our y value, 2 to the second, we end up with a point of 2, 4. Fairly easy to comprehend. But by doubling this number to 4, all of a sudden our y is much higher. In fact, 4 times higher than it was before. It's almost like some kind of exponential relationship. And so you can imagine that on the positive x side, as x continued to increase, y is going to increase more and more and more and more and more exponentially. On the negative side of the x, the same thing happens, only with fractions that get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Because remember how negative exponents work, right? If we have something like 2 to the negative 4, that's the same thing as 1 over 2 to the 4th, or 1/16. You can also picture, I hope, that what we're going to end up with here is a line that gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Smaller is not the right word, but it's the one that I'm using. I think you understand what I'm saying. Closer and closer and closer is a more accurate way to say it to the x-axis without ever actually touching it. Because if you think about it for a moment, there's nothing we could raise to. There's no power we could raise to that would give us a value of 0. So we've talked about this word asymptote before, but I want to make sure everybody understands it. This is what we call of this function. It's horizontal asymptote. There is a horizontal line which this curve will approach, but which will never actually touch. It will only get smaller and smaller and smaller. So you could sort of think of it like this. B to the x power will approach 0, never get there, but approach it as x approaches negative infinity. So as this line goes farther and farther this way, that That curve is going to get closer and closer and closer, but never reach. By the same token, b to the x power is going to approach infinity as x moves towards positive infinity. And I think you can see it from the curve there. The higher x is, or the larger x is in a positive direction, the higher and higher and steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper that curve is going to go until essentially it's going to be pointing as close to straight up as it can. So with that in mind, think about the last two types of problems. And like I said, based on those who have completed, this has gone fine so far, but I have a feeling there's going to be some questions about this as time goes on. So the first one is going to be what we do in MyMathLab when we have to sketch the graph of a function. Well, the nice part about that is they're almost always going to give us the b. So there, hopefully you figured out by now, it's really just about picking a set of values for x, computing it, and marking those points and getting a general sense of what the function looks like. So you may notice that in your book, they recommend -2, -1, 1, and 2. Not a bad way to go. If you really want to get a sense of how a curve gets extreme, you could pick much bigger values and you'll see them get even steeper or flatter depending on the way the curve is shaped. If on the other hand, they ask you to find a function by giving you a point, just remember at the end of the day, we have an x, and we have an f of x, or a y, if you want to think of it that way. So remember, this is always our base function. So we're just going to, this is a little hard to see, let me make this a little more visible. So if we pick a value of 2, and the reason that we have that x value of 2 is because they gave that to us as one of the points. We know that f of 2 equals b squared. Well, we also know in this case what b squared is equal to, so we can just set those two things equal to one another. If b squared equals 9/25, we take the square root of the whole thing. We end up with b equals 3/5. And so therefore, we can find this function, we can state it as f of x equals 3/5 to the x power. I'm going to give you some slightly more difficult ones this weekend, but if you've got this basic idea in your back pocket, or these ideas, I should say, you've got the concepts that you need. I want to give a personal thanks to Mr. Colin Blackwell. He and I had the chance to talk before today's lesson about the idea of setting up a discussion folder for you guys to be able to share questions with me and one another. So you're going to notice that that's now always going to be at the top of the page, starting with today. And you'll see a discussion for each day, as well as a basic summary of what that day's lesson was about. Those will stay open indefinitely. So anytime you need to go back to those and use them, feel free. Once again, have a great weekend. Good luck with your work. Remember, today will be the first grade. And be aware that starting next week, sometime early, we're going to look at our first quiz. But I'll definitely give you a heads up on that Monday before it occurs. All right, so winding down the first week, think about where you're at. What's working? What isn't? What can you adjust in the days to come? Once again, as always, to keep it short and simple, use the discussion boards. If you have any questions about what's going on, remember to check by date or contact me directly. But more important than anything else,